Hey guys, welcome to my second tutorial. This one is going to be about choosing colors. More specifically, it's going to be about using color editing tools to guide your color choices. When it comes to choosing colors, the choices that you make kind of depend on the brief. It depends on what you're going for. If you're drawing an existing character, you need to work with the colors that have already been established for that character. If you're drawing like a landscape with a dark mood, you have to choose the colors that fit the mood that you're going for. Those are situations where there's some constraints, some pre-existing conditions for the colors that you need to choose. I'm going to talk about how I choose colors when I have like nothing to go by. So when I'm totally free to choose any random color combination. And the reason for that is I think it's a good jumping off point to talk about how I think about color. And hopefully by showing you guys how I think about color and what's going on in my mind at the moment that I'm working with color, I can give you guys some interesting tips that you could maybe use for your own process. And I want to say that my approach to color is very personal. It's really based on taste. It's based on my own feelings, my own emotions at the moment that I'm drawing. So I definitely don't have a set of rules on how to approach color. I don't think there's one way to do it and one way not to do it. I really think that you just need to, draw on your own intuition, and your own emotional resonance with color. And I'm just going to talk about how I do it. And then hopefully in some way you can use that for your own intuitive process. So to start with, I'm just going to start really simple and abstract by kind of explaining the most simple breakdown of how I approach color. I've got my lasso tool and I'm just going to make a circle and just put down any color. So I had this one still from a previous drawing, and this is the one I'm going to kind of start with. So once I have a color, I'm already a step further than the blank canvas, right? Something is better than nothing. And I put down a totally random color, and so the first thing I'm going to do is open up my hue saturation sliders. Hue saturation is in image adjustments, or you can just use on Windows the shortcut Control U. And what hue saturation lets me do is just change the color. So first you have hue. Hue is sort of like the color itself. Is it blue? Is it red? Is it yellow? Saturation is the intensity of it. So, how extreme. So if you go for red and you go for most saturated, then you'll get a most intense red. Least saturated will become gray. And then the lightness is just how close to white or how close to black is it. And what happens, right now I have quite a low value color. The value is also the lightness or the darkness of it. The value is quite low, so the hue doesn't change a whole lot, It reads similar in all the different hues, but if I lighten it, so bring it closer to white and then amp up the saturation, you'll get more intensity there of all the different colors. And if you desaturate it a little bit, but also lighten it, then you'll get that nice pastel range of colors. So I learned a lot about color just by moving these sliders around and just seeing what happens. And this is really why I think digital media is amazing, because you don't have to know in advance which colors work and which don't. You just move the slider around and you just see for yourself. That gives you the space to kind of just feel the color. And I think it's deeply personal what your response to different colors will be. In my case, I always feel really drawn towards deep blue, aquamarine, and purple colors. Maybe that has to do with the fact that I grew up watching The Little Mermaid, and that I love underwater scenes. I also love warmer tones. And the ones in between, green, this kind of intense green, and magenta, for some reason, I never really feel drawn to them. I don't know why, but that's just what it is. So I think if you really struggle with having that intuitive connection to colors and really knowing which colors you like and which ones you don't, then I recommend just doing this exercise, move the sliders around, see what happens, see which ones you like, try to get a connection to your emotional reaction to the colors. So I'm going to start with the kind of color that I'm always drawn to, a kind of deep bluish color. So a color on its own is just a color, right? But I feel like colors really come to life when they are combined with other colors. So basically, it's about the relationship with another color that creates meaning and creates color interaction that activates the imagination. So if I sort of select an area of this one and I look for a second color, right? So I select it with my lasso tool and then I just move the hue saturation slider around. I can see sort of what happens when I have more of like an orangey tone against this blue. Then we get like sort of a playful vibe, like a graphic design kind of approach where two intensely contrasting colors have a playful effect together. There's also like similar colors. If you go towards more of like a turquoise color, then you get like this sort of synergy, like they feel unified. And then of course there's like, you know, this intense green. How does that interact? You get a bit of like maybe a grass and sky feeling from it. So how do colors interact? It's something that you need to see in front of you to know. And that's really how I learned everything I know about colors, is just trying to get to a situation where I could literally see the colors in front of me and then just analyze them, step back and kind of look at them and be like, what does this do to me? What are the emotions that I feel? I think colors are a very nostalgic thing, you know, a lot of the time, like the colors that we see, we associate them with things that we've seen in the past that have those colors. And the colors that I'm looking at now, this very intense green with this blue, right? It reminds me so much of like corporate logos and like early digital art and digital graphics in the early ages of internet. They always had this kind of stuff. And that's my association. But somebody who grows up in a different setting, has a different childhood, grows up in a different culture, might have different associations with this. So that's how color can be a deeply personal thing. You know, the colors that you choose, the colors that you don't like. Like I feel very repelled by this color combination, but somebody else might feel drawn to it for totally different reasons. And if you choose colors based on your own personal story and your own personal emotional background, then you make them truly meaningful to you. And that's something that I think is really important. So you have to see for yourself which colors have an impact on you. I tend to gravitate towards similar colors. You know, I want the colors to be in a similar range. I feel like that always brings harmony. And once you have two colors that work together, so we've already moved so far from the blank canvas because we have a first color, now we have a second color. Then you can think about like an accent. You can think about like a third color. So maybe like I'll select an area of this and think about like, how can we bring a third color to this? If you go for something really bright, like for example, like this sort of reddish pink, this rose color, then you get like this sort of playful pink accent. If you go for something like darker and more like in that range of blue, then you get like a sort of, you've got your light, you've got your middle and your dark, and then you start to get more depth in the colors that you've chosen. So really, for me, in the most basic sense, choosing colors is like a question of, you have your step 1, your base, step 2, your secondary color, step 3, something that works with the base and the secondary color. And then as I add more colors, I just try to make sure that they work with the colors that are already there. And that makes it a lot easier for me than to just throw a bunch of colors in there and try to make them work together. If I work from one color and then gradually kind of move from there, thoughtfully adding second, third, fourth, fifth colors based on how much they work with the first color that I chose, then I have a starting point that gives me grip on the choices that I make and that allows the color scheme to kind of evolve from there. So this, in the most basic sense, is like how I approach color. This is how I'm thinking when I'm adding color. I'm just trying to move those sliders around, see what happens, see the feeling that I get from it, and kind of like carefully adding new colors based on how they interact with the first color that I chose. I really don't base any of this on color theory, although color theory does provide a nice template for what works and what doesn't. So here's a random image that I got off the internet, and the color wheel does provide some useful tips, especially if you struggle with the intuitive aspect of color. What I get from it is like that similar colors always work well together, right? So if you have like your orange, your red, maybe your yellows, that always works together. That always feels harmonious. And then you've got your complementary colors, right? So that's like the color on the opposite side of the color wheel. They tend to work together quite well. For some reason, they feel, if you mix blue and orange, it just has just that right amount of contrast, just that right amount of difference between them that makes them somehow match. So from that process of adding one color, a second color, a third color, I tend to gravitate towards similar colors or opposite colors because that's just, for some reason, it feels right to humans. But I've never really looked at the color wheel, really studied it or analyzed it. I've noticed that this is what I gravitate towards. So now I'm going to kind of take it to the next step and show you guys how I would, use this general approach to adding color on a character. So I'm going to quickly sketch a character that I can use as a basis for this process. By the way, if you want to know more about how I approach construction of a face and of a character, definitely check out the tutorial that I made last month because that goes more in depth about how I construct these characters. Once I have my rough sketch, on top of that, I'm going to do a bit more of a definitive sketch with darker, more defined lines. All right, so now I've got a basic sketch. It is important to me that there are like 2 levels of intensity. So there's like the rough sketch with a lot of searching lines and a lot of like these softer lines. And I've got my more defined sketch, which if I got rid of the sketch underneath, it would not feel unified. But it was just to define certain areas. Having a mix of like defined and dark lines and softer, more searching lines is important to my approach for color. And I'll explain that in a minute. But for now, I'm going to group these 2 layers of sketches together and then duplicate that and merge it. So I always have like a backup of my separated lines in case I have to go back. And then on top, I have my sort of merged sketch lines together. I really always discourage people if they have a rough sketch and then put clean lines on top to like throw away the rough sketch. Like I always say, you have to keep it. So the first thing that I would do when adding colors to this sketch is like just kind of block out the silhouette with the lasso tool and then just throw down a random color, right? Right now that's black. I don't see anything anymore, so I'm just gonna use the hue saturation to lighten it again. What's really useful on the hue saturation slider window is that there's an option colorize over here. So I'm gonna click on that, and then when I do this, it gives me the option to add color to the color that I'm editing, because if I didn't select that, I wouldn't be able to change the hue because it's gray, and gray doesn't have a hue. But if I click on colorize, then it'll give me the option to sort of choose a color. And I'm just gonna slide it around. So I showed you guys earlier how I kind of move the slider around and just kind of see what happens. That's what I'm gonna do now, and just kind of think like, all right, what's my starting point gonna be for this drawing? Do I want like to go full fantasy and just do like a weird color, give her purple or blue skin? Do I want to go for like a more earthy, natural look, give her like a color skin that feels more like a real person's skin would be? How much imagination do I want to put into this, and what colors are resonating with me? With colors also, like the color that resonates with me depends, on the stage where I'm at in my artistic development, because there was a phase where like almost all the colors I chose were some variation of blue and pink because I love those colors. And now I'm more in like a sort of yellowy orange phase, right? These are the colors that speak to me at this moment. So I think I'm going to go for that. All right, so now I have a starting point. I have my first color. And then choosing the second color is fairly easy because you know that it has to fit with the first color. For the second color, I'm going to work on her hair because this is like sort of the second most prominent aspect of the drawing. So I'm going to select the hair with the lasso tool. And it doesn't have to be a perfect selection. It doesn't have to be perfectly clean because I can always fix it at a later point. And I'm going to look for that second color. Like, what am I looking for with this character? Do I want to give her like candy colored hair, or do I want like more natural tones? If I stay in the same value range, and value means like the lightness of the color. So if I stay in the same lightness area with the colors that I choose, I feel like there's a lack of contrast. I feel like they read too much in a similar range to really feel fresh somehow. Whereas if I go for like a darker color, then I get a nice contrast and her skin really starts to stand out. And if I go for a lighter color, same thing, but the skin stands out because it's darker. So that's how I approach it intuitively. I just kind of see for myself, like, what happens, what makes the drawing work and what makes it doesn't. It's a question of just trying something and then observing for yourself, like, what is and isn't working. So I'm going to slide it around and kind of see, like, all right, so, you know, purple hair gives like a sort of cute cotton candy effect for the hair, but it is a bit, for some reason, doesn't work with the skin tone for me. Whereas if I go for like warmer, more natural tones, it does feel better. Feels like it works better. If I go for like blue and green, it gets a bit extreme. It is very cute, but for some reason I gravitate towards this sort of more pinkish tone. Maybe I should lighten it a bit for more contrast. More of a soft, desaturated pink, that works for me. And when I push the saturation, somehow it loses how well it works. This is sort of like the sweet spot for me. That's how I'm feeling about this. On a different day, I might feel differently about it, and a different artist might feel differently about it too. But that's this works for me right now. So I have color 1, color 2. I need to think about sort of like 3rd, 4th, 5th colors. One thing I know for sure is the extra colors that I add have to work with these two somehow. They have to add like to the dynamic that's happening here with these soft natural colors. Otherwise, they won't work. Okay, so this brings me to another really important tip for color choices that I always emphasize during live demonstrations, during in step-by-steps and tutorials. So now I'm going to do her eyes, right? And if I make it white, like all the way white, to me, this just kind of kills the colors. Adding white to the drawing, it feels almost like I just deleted the color completely and the background is showing through. So in general, a tip that I can give is like, don't try to add literal white or black. Try to look for substitutes for that feel like white and black, but aren't quite as extreme, so that the colors still feel unified and vibrant, and the contrast is still there, but you're not like killing it with the brightest or darkest colors. So in this case, right, if I like lighten it just a little bit from the base color, I'm also getting the effect of an eye white, and it feels more together. If I saturate that a lot, it doesn't really look like eye white anymore. But if I desaturate it a bit, it does actually, because I start to get a bit of a contrast here between a more saturated tone and a desaturated tone. Let's see how dark I can go. You know, I think at this stage it's sort of pushing it. It doesn't feel white. But then when I go to this area, it starts to feel that way. Maybe a different hue could also do the trick, but that gives maybe a bit of a surreal effect. Maybe pushing it a little bit towards a yellow hue will just give it just that little amount of contrast that it feels like white, but it isn't white. So now I have like actually what's literally more of like a pinkish orangey gray, but it reads as white. And I didn't really like come up with this out of nowhere. I came up with this because I selected an area and then kind of like moved away from the base color with the hue saturation slider. And that I think works so much better than just sort of picking colors out of nowhere or picking colors from a palette. It's like, get your starting point and just kind of see how you can move away from that starting point to create interesting contrast. Now I'm going to sort of come up with a color for the eyes. So I'm going to get my hue saturation slider, darken it a little bit, and then saturate it. Maybe like I can make really bright and intense eyes that would really draw the attention to this area. And in that case, like it would work to add an accent that interacts nicely with the existing colors. So for example, if I make it a more saturated version of the hair, for example, then it creates like a nice sort of interaction, you know, between a softer version and a more intense version. Or I can go for like more yellowy, orangey tones. Maybe this feels a bit too light. Like if I go for dark, deep colors, so like very saturated but dark, and also see what happens there. And there are certain colors that for me really clash. Like I think this like green color really clashes with the rest of the colors. But then if I move towards blue, it creates like a nice contrast with the other colors. And again, the reason for that is because the complementary color for warmer tones is the cooler tones, right? So orange and blue. But similar colors also work. So I just want to see like, where do I want to go? Do I want to give her like really, like if I gave her very natural colored eyes, it would contrast interestingly with the hair, because then she would have like candy colored hair but have very natural skin and eyes, which would create an interesting visual effect. Or I could go for very extreme colored eyes to push the attention towards that. So I feel drawn towards the idea of the natural eye, so I'm going to go for like a brownish color, maybe caramel color. And lastly, I'll just do like on some areas of her face. So like make her lips a little bit darker and more saturated, and kind of make the eyebrows also darker. So I'm going for like a natural look in the face, and then like brighter color hair. So now I have my base colors selected, and it started with this one and it's sort of like moved out from there, you know. The next step was the hair, which has a nice interaction with this brown color, and then kind of like natural tones for the face, which were easy to pick because it was just kind of like colors that are in a similar color range to the base color. And so now we have a starting point for our color scheme. So this brings me to my next big bit of advice that I always say during every live demo, every tutorial, every step-by-step. I always emphasize how important it is. And that is to change the color of your sketch lines. So I'm going to set the sketch lines to multiply. That's really important. If you put it on normal, you won't get the same color interaction. So you have to put it on multiply. And then bring up your hue saturation slider again. And then you can kind of play around with the colors. And because it's set to multiply, there's an interaction with the colors underneath, which means like the lines will be darker on a darker base and lighter on a lighter base. Whereas if it was on normal, it wouldn't interact at all. It would be the same color everywhere. That's why it's really important to put it on multiply. And now I can kind of like move the slider around and see what happens. We'll get a lot of interesting interactions here. If I go towards more of like a bluish tone on the hue saturation slider, we get more intensity in the lines because they're complementary colors. Blue and warmer tones are complementary, so you get a more intense contrast between them. If you move towards similar tones as the base, like warmer tones, it's softer, maybe a bit too soft. Like the definition, you can see here in the navigator window that her nose like completely disappeared. The definition in her face is kind of gone. When we go to yellow, they're almost completely gone, yellow and green. And then when we move towards blue, it gets more intense again. And these are the things that like I learned about just by looking, just by seeing for myself what happens. And you can see that each different color creates a different mood for the overall color scheme. You know, if I go for like these kind of pinkish lines, it creates more of like a cotton candy feel. If I go for these ochre lines, it creates like something warm, sunny feeling. And when I go for green, it becomes like green is such a kooky color, becomes almost like electric in some areas. And that the same goes for like this teal blue color. I don't believe that these blue tones do a whole lot for the color scheme because they like cool the color down. Whereas the warmth of these colors was what was making them work for me. Maybe if you have a different taste in colors, this is what you would go for. So it's highly personal. Like I said, just depends on your taste. So I'm going to go for like these warm lines. I love what this sort of like orangey ochre is doing. I like the combination. It's just personal taste, but I really love the combination of pink and yellow. One thing is like if I choose this kind of ochre yellow color, so here it is without the base color underneath, so you can see it's like kind of a rich yellowy color, is working beautifully on the hair, but the lines kind of disappear on the face because somehow the interaction with this base color makes them kind of disappear. So I'm gonna just select the face area and just change the color of the lines there, which is like an easy trick. If you feel like the lines are working on really well on one area of your drawing and not very well on another, you can kind of like adjust the colors in that one area. So I'm just going to darken them, keep them very similar, but just darker version, maybe a bit more of a reddish version to work with the skin. So now you can see that, you know, the interaction of the lines with the base color is doing a lot more for the drawing as a whole. When it was desaturated like this, it just wasn't adding a whole lot, you know, it was just there, kind of weighing it down. And now with the colorful lines, it feels like it's being elevated, lifted up, and that it's more vibrant. And also the reason why I say you have to set it to multiply and give it a color is now like, okay, here we only have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 colors, right? Maybe like a 7th color if you add like this overlap here. This is not a whole lot of color. This is not a whole lot to work with. And if you want to add highlights and shadows to this, you have to do the work yourself. You have to choose the color and then find a highlight and a shadow color. But if you have these multiply lines with a color on them, we now have so many colors on this image. So we have like this kind of interaction of yellow and pink, which has created kind of like a deep orange tone. We have the parts where the lines are not on the base color, and then there we have like a beautiful ochre color. We have the parts where the lines are multiplying onto the darker base tones, like by the eyebrows, and that's kind of like a deep, rich brown color. And like I said, we don't want to use too much literal white and literal black on the image, right? Because that doesn't do a lot for the color scheme. But now we have substitutes for them. We have this as our substitute for white, and we have like these deeper, darker colors as a substitute for black. They bring the color scheme together rather than weigh it down. We have all these interesting new colors that exist. You can see, look at this little dot flying around, along the color picker. So many colors that we can work with. Whereas before we only had a couple of colors. So this is why it's very important for me to keep my rough sketch lines. The lighter lines create lighter colors. The darker lines create darker colors. And it just gives me a lot to work with at this stage. So now I'm going to move on to the next color editing tool that I love, which is color balance. I'm going to start by looking at the lasso tool. So I've had the lasso tool on 0 pixel feather, which means that if I modify it, there's going to be like hard edges. But you can feather it as well, which makes the edges soft, which is something I've talked about before in the step-by-steps. And that means that if I now select a certain area and then darken it, I'll get soft edges. And using the feathered lasso tool in combination with color balance is like the magical combination for me. That makes it really work. So I can sort of select areas with my feathered lasso tool and then open up color balance. Color balance is different from hue saturation. With hue saturation, you change like the color as a whole. It's quite an intense tool, it makes intense color changes. And especially when you have soft edges, you get like kind of weird blending effects here. With color balance, you're not changing the whole color, you're kind of pushing it in the direction of a color. So rather than make it blue, it sort of adds a little temperature of blue to the base color that you're working from, which makes the effects more subtle. You can choose from shadows, midtones, and highlights. So if you amp the shadows, you'll get like the darker tones changed. Midtones, we'll change the midtones. And with highlights, you get like more of an intense, like bright effect, which works nice for lighting. And I'm just going to use it to sort of bring more color to her face. I'll do a separate tutorial on skin tones at a later point because I think it's really important when drawing characters and working on the skin tones to make the skin tones believable by adding lots of skin tone variation. That makes the characters feel more alive. But for now, I'm just going to keep it simple, just add a little bit of blush to her cheeks, add a little bit of color to her nose. I can think about maybe like a highlight area. Do I want to have like a sort of more yellow highlight or a cooler highlight? I'm going to go for something more cyan-ish. I can sort of think about like whether I want her roots to be darker, and then if I do I want them to be more of like a purpley color or more of like a red color? So I'm just kind of playing around and seeing what happens. So this combination of color balance and the feathered lasso tool is what really allows me to search for interesting variations in the tones. Another thing that helps me bring the color scheme to life is using the gradient tool. The gradient tool is essentially quite similar to the feathered lasso tool, but it creates like a soft effect. So if I have it set to like a circular gradient with foreground to transparent, if I do foreground to another color, then it's going to put a gradient over the whole layer and the background color will be like all over, which isn't very useful. But if I do it foreground to transparent, then it won't like it doesn't like cover everything up with the background color. You can make it small, you can make it big. So the gradient tool is amazing. And I'm going to select the hair with the wand tool. Now that I have these colors here, I get inspiration and ideas for how I can move forward from here, you know? So I have this beautiful ochre color that I love, that combines really beautifully with pink. And now I'm going to sort of put that ochre color like in the hair, maybe towards the bottom, kind of see what happens there. And when I do that, I get new colors, new interactions between the lines and the base color there. So I really like what's happening there, but I'm going to keep it very subtle, not too extreme, just along the bottom edge. And the next step would be to merge the lines with the base color so that I have everything together. And the reason that I like to merge everything together is just so that I can modify the colors of the whole image, everything as a whole, rather than just modifying only the lines or only the base color. It's nice to have everything together. And that brings me to my third color editing tool that I really love, and that is selective color. Selective color doesn't have a shortcut, so you can find it in Image, Adjustments, Selective Color. And I honestly discovered this tool by accident. I clicked on it, actually wanting to click on something else, and this came up. And then I just started playing around with the sliders, and I just loved what it did. Selective color, I say hue saturation is the least subtle of all the color editing tools, and selective color is the most subtle, with color balance in the middle. Selective color allows you to sort of pick a color from a range here. So to pick like the reds, yellows, greens, etc. of your drawing, and then push that color range in a certain direction. So I have my reds selected now. There are a lot of reds in this image, right? Because it has like a warmer tone. And if I push that towards this side, it amplifies them. It makes them kind of glow with warmth. If I push it in this direction, it becomes more of like a sort of greenish tone, which is also nice. I can push it towards like super green or towards magenta. I can make it more cool, more pinkish, or I can make it more yellowish. And the most interesting thing about selective color is that I can also say how light or how dark I want that range of color to be. So I can lighten it up. As you can see, this washes out the color really badly. Or I can darken it, which creates like an intense contrast, which looks kind of nice. So I'm going to darken it a little bit, and maybe, do I want to push those reds or do I want to tone them down? I don't know. I'm going to sort of mess around with the slider. While doing this, I'm keeping an eye on the small, like the navigator view of the image so that I can see how it works from afar, whether it's having an impact from a distance. And I'm just going to sort of slide this around and kind of see what happens. So like in that first exercise I showed you, it's just a question of moving a slider and just kind of waiting and seeing how it resonates. How do you feel about it? What emotion does it create? Does it push the aspects that you like? Or does it kind of tone them down and wash them out? And the key is that if you have something that you like about your color scheme, like in this case, I love the warmth, then you want to make color editing choices that amplify that warmth, that push it further. You want to see if you can maximize the intensity and the impact of that warmth. I'm going to push it a little bit towards this one because I love the contrast that creates between the skin and the hair. And a little bit of yellow and a little darker. I can also push the yellows, see what happens there. I never know in advance how these sliders are specifically going to impact the drawing. I just experiment, just go down the line and just see what happens. And greens, nothing will change, nothing will happen because there's no greens in the image. There's also no magentas. This Photoshop is not reading any magentas in this image. So this is why I love selective color the most, is because of its ability to play around with what it calls the whites, which is like the lighter tones in the image. And what I love is like when I take the whites and I darken them through selective color, it sort of like fuses everything together. It brings the lighter tones together with the midtones. And then you can sort of like mess around with the temperature of these lighter tones. I always feel like this creates a unique ability to deepen those colors. But as you can see, when I lower the whites completely, we lose all of the line work here on the hair. So I don't want to go all the way. I want to preserve the line work a little bit, but I do want to deepen these whites and see if I can give them a color temperature, color tone that makes the hair feel extra fluffy and warm. And I notice like when I push towards this direction, amplifying the yellow, we get a lot of warmth. And when I push it away from magenta, it even becomes sort of a cream tone, which is kind of nice. But I don't want to lose the pink. So I'm going a little bit creamy, but not losing the pink. The neutrals has the most intense effect. I'd say it's fairly similar to what color balance does. So it has like quite an extreme effect on this image. I don't want to play around with it too much because I kind of like where we are at this stage. So I'm going to tweak it a tiny, tiny little bit. And the blacks are like, as you can see, it reads this area as blacks. And changing the color of the blacks can be interesting, especially adding like a bit of a bluish tone to them. But most of the time, it just kind of knocks the harmony out of the colors that I already have. So I'm not going to go too extreme with this. Maybe I want to add a little bit of extra contrast by darkening them quite a lot. All right, so now we've sort of put a selective color pass over this, and here's the difference. It's very subtle. It's just a minimal change in color, but to me, it brought everything together, and I love what it did to the hair. So as I'm drawing, when I make digital paintings, I'm really like constantly bringing these color editing tools into the process. I'm constantly opening my color balance and kind of seeing like, oh, do I want to push it in any direction? And I'm constantly bringing in my selective color. And the reason for that is also like the more details that are added, the more the color relationships maybe start to evolve and change, or certain colors start to like become more prominent. And then you want to keep exploring ways to push that, to make the things that work even better with the color editing tools. So now that I'm at this stage, what I would do is just zoom in and bring in my brush, just my normal hard round brush, and just kind of like use the colors that are on the canvas to kind of sculpt, what I say, sculpt with color. So to kind of like add more definition to certain areas. And the reason why I say like it's not important to make it all perfect, like in this case, the circle that I drew for the eye like sort of overlapped and covered the skin. But after all the color editing, it created like a dark color that I can use. And also here are some nice dark colors that I can use to define the drawing a bit more. So I'm just going to, as much as possible, pick colors that are already there and use those colors to paint, basically, to paint in the details and define this character. So I always start with the eyes. I always start with the focal point in general. The focal point is something that I talked about a little more in the previous tutorial, but focal point is really important. You want to know where you want people to look. So in this case, like I really want people to look at her eyes, look at her expression. So then it's good to start adding the detail there, like to start there first and then sort of move out from there. But you want the highest amount of detail in the focal point area. And I don't just want to use these darker colors to define, but I can also sort of pick these lighter colors, these rich brown tones, and use those to define the eyes as well. So I don't want to stick to just like one line color for everything. I want to have a variation of different line colors that sort of come from the image. I have this sort of darker, sort of creamy tone for the eye whites. They read as a sort of desaturated tone. In reality, it's not totally gray. And now that I have this darker tone, I can have way more impact when I add a highlight to the eye. So if I add like a slightly lighter color, that already has way more impact than if it was already white. So I'm just going to add a little bit more definition. Another thing that I love about the hard round is I can like make the brush quite small, but I can also make the brush quite large. So I can make like small definitive lines, or if I make it larger and press softly, it creates like more of a soft painting effect. So I can use that to add some definition to the nose and paint a little bit. And for me, like once I've reached this point where the colors are already there, they're like on the canvas, and I don't need to introduce too many new colors. I'm just mainly using the colors that are on the canvas. It's just so intuitive. It's so easy to add those details. You only have to think about the details you want to add, and you don't have to think about like, oh, which color do I want to use? You know, which color works here? And if I'm doing like highlight for her lips, for example, instead of like finding a new highlight color, I could just use a color that's already there. I could just use like the color on her hair, color of the accent here. And the more I use colors that are already on the canvas, the more harmony we're going to have, you know, in our drawing. Another thing that happens when I use these multiply lines is that I get some interesting variations, right? So I have like the deeper color here that I'm picking off of the lines over her skin. And then I have like these kind of more bright ochre lines. And I can use, for example, here you can see that by coincidence, I guess because I was so messy about the lasso shape that I had drawn for the skin, this line is darker, but then it sort of moves to a lighter line here, right? So I can pick that lighter line color and use that to sort of like outline her face. And it just creates more of like a dynamic feeling in the colors, to not only use these dark lines to outline when I'm sort of painting in the details, but also these lighter lines, and kind of distribute them over the image to get a nice blended effect, to make it feel unified and not like these dark lines are covering the whole image. For her eyes as well, instead of choosing a new color, I could just pick something that's happening over here, maybe like a sort of orangey tone in these lines, and use that to sort of add more definition to the iris. So hopefully this has showed you guys how I go from starting with just one color, which is like this base color for the skin, to a second color, third, fourth, fifth, and how changing the line color brings life to the colors that I choose. It like elevates them, amplifies them, and how I'm using color editing tools all the while to sort of bring the colors together, to amplify the colors that work, and to gradually push the aspects that are working best, in my opinion. I hope this shows you as well, like how subjective color choices are for me, you know, how much they're based on just what feels right to me, and how I use these color editing tools to constantly search for it, you know, to constantly just tweak and explore and observe and just feel the colors. That's really how I do it. So I know that it sounds super vague when I say that my approach to color is intuitive, but I hope that this shows you literally how I do it. I just want to talk about like some things that I keep in mind when I'm rendering and painting, and sort of like using the colors that I have. So if I have this, right, I have like my drawing that I'm working from, I'm going to try and pick colors that are on the canvas as much as possible to add detail. And there comes a point where you have to start layering in highlights and shadow colors. So you have to start thinking about like not only using the colors on the canvas, but maybe trying to like add a little bit of an extra highlight, an extra pop. When choosing colors for that, I think it's really important not to go too extreme, and to look for colors that aren't like just lighter versions or darker versions of the base color. So I'll show you why. So if I have like a starting point, let's say the skin tone, and I'm going to blend in like a highlight, and I go for something like quite extreme. So we have our new and our current color here, so we can kind of compare it to the previous color. And I'm just going to go for something lighter, and I have that. I'm going to put that there. I have my hard round brush, and I'm going to use that to kind of like blend it, right? And so I pick the intermediate tones, and I just kind of blend it. I've got my lighter tone, my darker tone. What happens is that the colors in between, I think, are not vibrant. You know, we have like, this color is quite nice, this color is quite nice, but all the colors in between are just, I don't know, they're just not really vibrant. And when you mix them, it feels like muddy, like plasticky. It's lacking life. And when you look at this little guy jumping around on the color box, it's just following a very boring and predictable trajectory up towards the corner. This is something I try to avoid when blending. So what I would do rather than just simply pick that lighter color is to just slowly, in small steps, move up towards that highlight. Maybe not even go straight for such a light color. I don't want to pick something that is just a lighter color of the base. Rather than just go up, what is a different path that I can take? Can I go towards more saturated? What happens when I do that? And how can I stay almost in the same value range while still getting maximum impact of like a contrast and something different? So here I'm almost in the same value range, but I've just reached something more saturated. And when I blend that, you get something a lot more interesting. You get deeper, richer tones in the middle. And if I were to put like a highlight on top of this one, you know, that's what I mean with going step by step towards the lighter color. It's not just like, bam, straight towards the lighter color, but maybe like slowly move towards it. What if I go for something even more saturated, but then shift the hue a little bit, you know, like if I go towards red, I think this is kind of an uncomfortable balance. Somehow they don't contrast well enough, doesn't feel fresh. But if I move towards like orangey tones, for example, and then bring it down a bit, then I get something interesting going on here, an interesting mix. And if I blend that on top of this, for example, we get something much richer, you know, much more appealing. Let's say I want to push that even further and add like a little bit. So now we get something much more, I think, rich and beautiful going on, you know? And if we bring in our color picker to analyze it, you can see that it's shifting, changing, it's moving up, but the hue is changing as it goes along, and it's not just going towards the lighter part. It's taking an interesting journey, so to speak, over the color map. But this is something that I try to aim for. All right, so basically how that applies to choosing highlight colors for my drawing is that if I want like a highlight color for the skin, for example, I'm not going to just like choose a lighter color. I'm going to try and search for that interesting journey towards something lighter. And I'm going to see like, for example, what would happen if I go for something in a similar value range, but just more desaturated? Instead of just going up towards a lighter color, what if I go for more grayish version of the base color? What happens then? This feels more interesting to me than, for example, just choosing a lighter version of the color, which would be like this. Which also works, you know, but this is more exciting to me when it's similar but different. And not just different in the sense of different value, but also different in terms of hue and saturation. Shadows, similar principle. So let's say I pick a shadow tone. We have some good shadow colors already on the canvas from the lines, right? But we don't want to just layer darker and darker tones. Like what would happen if I tried to introduce kind of a bluish tone? Like that could work really well because we have warm tones and blue would bring out the warmth with the contrast, right? So let's say I pick a blue color, very intense. I don't want to just slam that on there because that's going to feel like not unified with the drawing. But if we just very softly paint that on and then kind of pick the middle tones and sort of blend that into the shadows, then we get like a nice sort of bounce light effect, you know, which works kind of nicely to amplify the warmth. And when you look at it on the color picker, it's actually just kind of a grayish tone. It didn't even move out of the orangey range, but it feels sort of bluish because we blended it in. One final thing that I want to talk about a little bit is color distribution. So the colors, they gain meaning because of their relationships, right? So I was talking about like the base color gets a different dimension when combined with a secondary color or a certain accent. That's what sort of brings it to life. It's not the color on its own. It's how that color interacts with the other colors. And it's also the distribution of the color that creates interest, that makes them stand out. So you have like generally a sort of like base color, the color that is established as being the main neutral tone, because there's a lot of it. In this case, our base color, our neutral tone are like these warm tones, you know, like this, like these orangey tones. That's our base. And then you have your accent, which is like the thing that pops out against the base tone. The accent, you can identify it because it's just the color that pops. So in this case, I really feel that the accent is this orange and yellow tone. That's the one that stands out because it's slightly different from the base. It's more intense, it's a slightly different hue, and there's less of it on the image, which makes it stand out even more. So if I have my accent color, like here, I can sort of distribute it along the image in a playful way, and it will stand out because it's got that sort of accent effect. So like if I were to like give her like an earring, for example, wouldn't that be cute if it was the accent color? Because then that sort of allows your eye to kind of bounce around and sort of see that color. I could put a little bit of that accent color around the eye shine, and then we would also get like a fun, playful distribution of that accent color. It's not just about, you know, which colors you use, but it's about like which one are your main colors and which ones are your accent colors. Another thing that I use a lot in my art are bright edge color lines. So you can see the way that I sort of developed that approach is it was a side effect of using multiply lines. Because as you can see, the multiply lines are darker here and lighter here, right? So we have like some areas where the lines are just this color, and then some areas where the lines are suddenly a bright yellow. And when I was rendering my drawings, I sort of picked these lighter colors in some areas to define the lines. I would just sort of go along and sort of find these bright colors and use them, and I would have like a variation, you know, between this yellow tone and then maybe the darker orange tone and this yellow tone, and that sort of created like this stylized effect of adding bright outer lines to the shapes. I could even add that here along the eye. You know, I could define this area by outlining it in yellow. This is just a stylized technique for distributing this color along the image. I also sometimes take the lasso tool and grab the outer edges, just messy sort of selection, and then I'll get my color balance and sort of like maybe push the colors there, kind of play around with the sliders, and then now I have like a sort of bright outer edge. So this is something that I use a lot. It's just a way of establishing which color is the playful color and then distributing it, peppering it along the image for a playful effect. And finally, something that I do a lot when I am rendering and painting is to add color gradients, like gradations, in as many areas as possible. So that means like, for example, right now I have this pupil, right, which is just like a dark pupil. What I can do to make that more interesting is sort of like kind of blend in a more rich brownish tone in that pupil. I don't have a flat color, but I have a nice gradation from one color to the next. And I can do that in all different kinds of areas, you know. Here is like a dark area, the eyelash. I can bring in like a bit of a deep blue tone just for some fun contrast, and then just paint that in. And then it will still read the same in terms of shape and contrast. But from a distance, you can see that there's like some changes happening over the shape, and that will lead the eye. If I'm drawing like this sort of like tank top strap, for example, and I pick like a darker color, then I could add a little bit of a gradient. I could blend in a little bit of this color here. And that ensures that every shape that you look at, like every solid form, still has movement in it through color. And it's another fun way to kind of distribute colors and accents over the image. So that's basically how I build up a color scheme intuitively and kind of play around to see how I want it, which direction I want it to go, and then distribute the colors and emphasize them in a way that amplifies the effect that I'm going for. This is just a messy sketch for the sake of this tutorial. But I will also kind of analyze a couple of works that I've done in the past to show you guys how I apply this to more detailed paintings. So here's a painting that I made last year. It illustrates quite well the intuitive color choosing technique that I explained. So here's our first sketch, right? And you can see that I changed the line color to like a bright pink. So we have like these base colors underneath. It is just very simple, only like I think 4 colors. This sort of brownish starting point, like a intense red pink, a blue, and like a dark blue for her hair. And then by adding these pink lines on top, we got a bunch of new colors there. So there's like this kind of neon pink that's coming out here, and then also the way that the pink blends with the darker colors in the drawing. And then when I was sort of working out the details a little more, bringing in my brush, kind of like using the colors that were there to further detail, you can see the pink is still there. It's still sticking out in some areas, but it's becoming like blended in. And I've started using some of the darker tones that showed up here, because I added like a little bit of a dark streak on her face, which created an interesting interaction with the pink lines here. And that's what I'm using for the shadows of her skin, for example. And I'm kind of like adding colors one by one, seeing how well they work with the colors that I had initially put down. So adding like this ochre colored t-shirt, because that interacts well with the skin tone that I had put down. And kind of like putting a bit of that intense aquamarine blue in the hair. So kind of playing around with how I can maximize this color scheme that I'd come up with. And then in the final painting, so this is the whole process of rendering. I could do a separate tutorial on rendering in the future, just to show you guys how I would finalize, paint and finalize this drawing. What I want to show you most of all is how those initial colors, from those color lines and from this sort of gradual color exploration found their way into the final piece. Because in the final piece, you can see that there's like a kind of pink edge, right, on the lines. Also here. And that's because of those pink lines that I had made initially that were kind of showing through here. That ended up becoming a way to outline, but it became more of a coral color over time, probably because I was using a lot of color editing tools as I went along and pushing that pink towards a more reddish tone. You can see that I sort of distributed the colors all around. So this color, I sort of put it in here. This reddish tone kind of made that an outline on these blue shapes. I tried to find a way to like bring these colors, sort of distribute them all around to get that playful effect. And I tried to make sure that every shape had a bit of a color gradation in there. So, these lines, that they wouldn't just be plain yellow lines, but that they would fade gradually into this reddish tone. And that, for example, this, like her sort of underwear showing through, also has a bit of a color gradation. And her hair as well. So every opportunity that I had to add a little bit of movement, a little bit of color variation to a shape, I tried to add that. And you can also see that we have a clear color accent. So we have like warm, ochre tones for most of it. And then the blue works as an accent. So an intense sort of pop accent against the rest. So that's how I apply those techniques to my sort of detailed paintings. Another example of this is my painting Lemons, in which case the cooler tones sort of form the base color, the base tone, and warmer tones are the accent. So it's sort of the opposite of the last one. I'm going to open the process for this, and you can see that like I was really searching for colors throughout the process of this one. I started with this, right? So I knew that like I wanted the character to be dark, to be illuminated against a lighter background, but I constantly struggled with how to make that come together. So initially it was just the dark base, and then sort of bringing in those lighter tones. And now I sort of lightened the whole image because I felt like it was getting too dark. And then in the next step, you can see that I'm working in more like pinkish, reddish tones because I felt like this was too brown. It was not as fresh as I wanted it to be. So I'm working in more like pinks, more like bright blues. Every step I was tweaking with the color editing tools a lot to just try and find that perfect balance. I amplified the sort of lemony yellow color of the lemons. And then as I'm moving forward, I add more detail, I render it out a little more, and then the more I render it, the more I feel like, all right, the colors need even more adjustment. So that's when I went to a more like fresh, violet, bluish tone in the background, and then slowly started to work from there. So that's how I was searching for the color for this. So this is to show you guys that I don't like land on these colors immediately. I have to go through a whole process of kind of looking for the colors and tweaking them as I go and constantly adjusting and changing them. And when I look at the final image, it's got like a lot of elements that I mentioned before. So there's that color accent, right? This is clearly the color accent against like a purple bluish background. And the reason that yellow works really well as an accent is because it's a complementary color to purple. So this is generally building on the idea of purple-yellow complementary contrast. This is not something that I consciously decided beforehand. It's just something that I gravitated towards because that's just what works. You can also see that I have distributed that accent along the outer edge, right? So you can see it's all along the figure is like a kind of yellow line. And that is just for that playful distribution of accent colors. And this drawing is also a pretty good illustration of how using highlight and shadow colors that aren't just darker or lighter versions of the base color can give more dimension. So the base color is sort of like this purpley color. And in some areas, I've made like an intense aquamarine kind of highlight. In other areas, I have more of a violet highlight. The shadow colors are in some areas more of like a yellowy tone, sometimes more of a purpley tone. It really jumps around amongst different colors. And in some areas, we've got more of like a purple as our main highlight. And in some areas, it becomes more of like an intense blue, especially around the areas where there's a bit of a bright accent line. This is just from searching for interesting tones, you know? This is really the result of getting my base color and then going to my Explorer window for the color picker and just kind of searching for something that's interesting and something that works. So it's really an intuitive process, an exploratory process of drawing something and then testing to see if it works. So I hope this tutorial explains to you guys how I think about color, what's going through my brain as I'm choosing the colors, and how once I have the colors, I try to use what I have as creatively as possible to amplify the final effect of my drawing. So I hope this tutorial does a good job of explaining to you guys how I approach color and how I try to optimize the tools that digital media has for choosing my colors. So I really try to use those sliders as much as I can to search for the color, because then I don't have to know in advance which colors work and which ones don't. I can just kind of experiment and play around with them and constantly search for the colors that work for me. I hope it also showed how setting the lines to multiply and changing the color of them has such a huge impact on all of my art. You can see it in my sketches, you can see it in my paintings. Changing the color of the lines is what elevates the color scheme and allows me to search for those interesting interactions. And you can see that in almost all of my paintings, that those color lines become an integrated whole. They become painted into the final piece. So the main tips that I can give you for this process, basically what I've explained to you already, but first of all, play around with the sliders. So if you don't do this already, just as much as possible during your drawing process, bring up these color editing tools and just play around with the sliders and see what happens. You'll get some interesting effects that maybe you didn't plan or you didn't predict. Just experiment with that stuff, see what happens, see what resonates with you, and try to train the part of your brain that has an intuitive and emotional response to color so that you can fall back on this technique and it becomes kind of automatic when you're choosing your colors. My second tip is to play around with unexpected colors for shadows and highlights. And what I mean is, don't just choose a lighter version of your base color and a darker version of your base color for the highlights and shadows. Especially if you're someone who struggles with muddy colors or you feel like it's just not dynamic, the colors that you choose. Push yourself to get super experimental with the colors that you choose for shadows and highlights. You can really choose quite extreme colors for them and it still reads as a shadow or as a highlight if it has just that right amount of contrast with the base color. So experiment, push the limits of what's possible, and you'll probably get some interesting results. And finally, when you're distributing your colors, try to be playful about it. I'd say play around with color distribution and try to find ways to be creative in how you blend those colors together and place those colors over your image. So I hope that this tutorial was helpful in some way. I hope that it had some techniques that you can use for your own art, and that at the very least it gave you new ideas on how you can look at color, experience color, and play around with color. Thanks so much for your support. Don't forget to vote on which tutorial video I should do next. And as always, thank you so much for being my patron. Bye-bye.